Hey everyone, my name is Curtis, and I never thought I'd be the kind of person who tells a story like this. I'm not someone who broadcasts personal things. I never have been. I'm the guy who fixes the gutters before they overflow, who reads the fine print on contracts, who shows up early and stays late, and keeps his mouth shut about the things that bother him because he believed, that a solid, consistent presence was its own kind of love language. I was good at the quiet work of a life. The maintenance. The showing up. I was 41 years old when my marriage ended. Not in a fight, not in a single dramatic moment, though there was one of those too. It ended the way most things I've come to understand actually end, in accumulation. Layer by invisible layer, decision by quiet decision, until one morning you're standing in a kitchen that still smells like the coffee you've made together for 9 years, and you realize the architecture you thought you were living inside had been hollow for a long time. Renee was the kind of woman who made rooms feel organized just by entering them. That's the only way I know how to describe it. She had a quality of deliberate composure, everything in its place, every impression managed, every outcome considered at least 2 steps ahead. I found this attractive for most of our marriage. I found it terrifying by the end. We'd been together for 9 years, married for 7 of them, no children. That had been a conversation we'd had and returned to, and eventually, quietly, allowed to go unresolved, which I understand now was its own kind of symptom. We lived in a house that we'd renovated over 3 years, slowly, room by room, the way you do when you're building something you intend to keep. The night that cracked everything open started as a company party. Her company, a corporate consultancy where she'd risen steadily over the past 4 years to a senior project management role. The event was at a rooftop venue downtown, the kind of place with recessed lighting and bartenders who know how to dress. She'd mentioned it 2 weeks earlier, told me I was welcome to come, and I had, because that's what I did. I showed up. I remember standing at the edge of the rooftop terrace with a drink I wasn't really tasting, watching Renee work the room. She was good at this, the handshakes, the eye contact, the calibrated laugh. I'd watched her do it before. But that night, something was different in the calibration. She didn't come back to me. Not once in 3 hours did she cross the room to stand beside me, to include me in a conversation, to acknowledge with a glance or a hand on an arm that I was there and that my being there mattered. I watched this happen slowly, the way you watch a tide go out. You don't notice any single moment of recession, only the growing distance between where you're standing and the water. At some point near 11 o'clock, I saw her laughing with a man I didn't know. Dark jacket, the particular ease of someone comfortable in expensive rooms. I watched for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough to register the specific quality of her attention. Not professional, not performed, but real. And then I set my unfinished drink on the nearest surface and went to find my jacket. I told myself I was tired. I told myself she'd be home soon. I took the elevator down, walked to my car, and drove away. I didn't know that the moment I left, she stopped pretending. Curtis's opening establishes the psychological profile of a man who has confused consistency with communication, who has mistaken the reliable performance of domestic duty for genuine emotional presence. His self-description as someone who keeps his mouth shut about the things that bother him is not a virtue he's simply reporting. It is the foundational blind spot of his entire narrative. The marriage's central dysfunction was not Renee's duplicity alone, but the complementary dynamic in which Curtis's avoidance of uncomfortable conversations created space for concealment to grow undisturbed. His description of Renee, someone who makes rooms feel organized just by entering them, reveals both his genuine admiration and his fundamental misreading of her. He has interpreted her quality of deliberate composure as an aesthetic gift when it is, in fact, a behavioral trait, the capacity for managed self-presentation that will later reveal itself as systematic deception. The rooftop party is the story's inciting emotional rupture. 3 hours of public invisibility, not hostility, not coldness, just the specific erasure of not being looked for, functions as the clearest possible behavioral signal. Renee is not managing her husband's presence that evening. She has stopped factoring him in. This is the psychological stage researchers call relational disengagement, the point at which a partner's internal account of the relationship has already closed, even as the external structure continues. Curtis feels the withdrawal but assigns it to his own fatigue rather than to its actual source. The elevator ride down is not just a physical departure. It is a man retreating from a discomfort he is not yet ready to name. The days after the party had the texture of something resuming rather than something continuing. That's the distinction I've come to understand. The difference between a life that keeps moving forward and a life that is merely restarting itself, running the same loop on a mechanism that is slowly losing tension. Our mornings looked the same. Coffee at 7:15. Her schedule checked on her phone before she'd finished the first cup. My keys found on the hook by the door where I always left them. The small, synchronized choreography of two people who have shared a kitchen long enough to move around each other without thinking. But the thinking had changed. After the party, I started noticing her phone the way you suddenly notice a sound in a wall that you suspect has been there for a long time. It had always been present. Now it was present in a different way. Face down was the new resting position, not dramatically hidden, nothing like slapping it against a table when I walked in, but a consistent, habitual face down that I began to track the way you track a pattern in a spreadsheet. For days in a row. 7 days. 10. She'd always been private with her phone. This was something I'd accepted years ago, filed under she's a private person without examining the filing too carefully. But privacy is static. What I was watching now had a quality of maintenance to it. A slight tensing when the device buzzed, a fractional delay before she reached for it, a screen that rotated away as she lifted it, not toward me but away. One Tuesday evening, I came into the kitchen from the garage and found her at the counter, typing with a focus that I recognized, the compressed attention of someone mid-sentence with someone who matters. She heard me, and the phone was face down in one fluid movement. So practiced, it was almost graceful. "Jess," she said before I asked. "She's going through something." I said I was sorry to hear that. I opened the refrigerator. I stared at its contents for a moment longer than necessary. Jess, her college friend, the one she'd known for 15 years, the one whose name had become, I would later understand, a reliable and largely unexamined alibi. The first girls' night came on a Friday 3 weeks after the party. She told me on Thursday, casual, offered with the easy confidence of something that requires no negotiation. Jess needed her. Some of the old group were meeting. She'd probably stay at Jess's if it got late. She didn't want to worry about driving. I said, of course. I said, have a good time. I said, tell Jess I was thinking of her. Renee smiled in the brief, appreciative way of someone who has received a more convenient response than they expected. She left at 7 p.m. in the dark green dress I'd seen once before, a dress I associated with occasions she considered significant, which I registered and then actively chose not to pursue. She came home the next morning at 9:30, looking well-rested in a way that didn't fully match the narrative of a long evening with friends who were going through something. I made her coffee. She showered. We spent Saturday in the ordinary way of a Saturday. But I had started, without making a conscious decision to do so, paying attention. My friend Theo was the first person who said, out loud, what I'd been refusing to think. We were in his garage on a Sunday, the way we spent most Sunday afternoons, working on an engine he was restoring, the radio at low volume, and the smell of motor oil and old metal around us. I hadn't told him about the party. I hadn't told him about the phone or the dress or the well-rested Saturday morning. I had told him nothing, because telling someone makes a thing real in a way that private suspicion doesn't. But he'd known me for 19 years, and he looked at me at some point over the engine and said, "You're carrying something." "I'm fine," I said. "Okay," he said, and handed me a wrench. But his tone was the tone of someone who has registered a discrepancy and decided not to press it. Yet. I drove home with the radio off, which I never did. That night, Renee went to bed at 9:45, which was early for her, saying she had an early call. I sat in the living room for 2 hours in the dark, which was not something I did, and I thought about the man from the party, his posture, his ease, the specific quality of her laugh when she was standing beside him. And then I thought, what do I actually know? Nothing. I know nothing. But knowing nothing, I was beginning to understand, is not the same as nothing being there. The change in her appearance was gradual enough that I almost didn't notice it as a pattern. She'd always taken care of herself. This was not new. But there's a version of self-care that is oriented inward, the cultivation of personal comfort and health. And there's a version that is oriented outward, toward the effect of being seen. The second version had been steadily replacing the first. New things appearing in the bathroom. A different moisturizer, a new shade of something on the shelf, a perfume I didn't recognize that she explained as a gift from a colleague I'd never met. The gym schedule shifted. She'd been a twice-a-week morning person for years. Now it was 4 times, including a Thursday evening slot that hadn't existed before. She came home from these sessions looking deliberate, makeup refreshed rather than stripped, hair arranged rather than post-workout loose. I am not, I want to be clear, a suspicious person by nature. I had no history of jealousy, no pattern of controlling behavior, no previous relationship that had taught me to look for these things. I was reading them now, slowly and reluctantly, the way you read a document in a language you're learning, haltingly, uncertain of the nuance, hoping you've mistranslated. It was on a Wednesday morning, reaching across the counter for my keys, that I saw a flash of her unlocked screen before she turned it over. A name, Clay, and a message preview. Last night was. The screen went dark. She hadn't seen me see it. I picked up my keys and went to work. I sat in my car in the parking structure for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to go inside. This section maps the psychology of selective attention beginning to fail, the point at which Curtis's practiced habit of benign interpretation is overwhelmed by accumulating dissonance. For the better part of the marriage's deteriorating period, Curtis has been operating on what psychologists call a charity heuristic, the systematic interpretation of ambiguous evidence in the most favorable direction available. The face-down phone is privacy. The new dress is occasion. The well-rested Saturday morning is a good night with friends. Each individual reframing is plausible. The accumulation is not. What's psychologically significant about the gym schedule change and the appearance shift is that Curtis identifies them correctly. He can distinguish between inward-oriented and outward-oriented self-care, but stops short of following the identification to its conclusion. This is motivated cognition, the brain accurately perceiving but refusing to process, because processing would require action, and action would require dismantling the structure of a 9-year marriage. Theo's observation in the garage, "You're carrying something," functions as a crucial external reality check. Someone who has known Curtis for 19 years can perceive the cognitive load he's carrying even when Curtis himself has categorized it as nothing. This is the role of trusted witnesses in crisis. They reflect back what we cannot afford to see directly. The glimpsed message, Clay, last night is the section's detonation point. Not because it proves anything, but because it defeats the charity heuristic. Curtis can no longer construct a plausible, innocent explanation quickly enough to neutralize what he has seen. The 11 minutes in the parking structure is the story's first explicit portrait of a man processing information his life has not prepared him to receive. I became, in the weeks after that Wednesday, a different kind of person. Not dramatically. Nothing about my external life changed in any way that anyone would have noticed. I went to work. I came home. I maintained the surface of the life Renee and I shared with the same reliable consistency I'd always maintained it. But underneath the surface, something had shifted permanently. I was watching now, with the full attention I'd been withholding, and what I found when I watched carefully was more than I'd been prepared to find. The name Clay. I ran it through the simple geography of what I knew about Renee's professional world and arrived at a reasonable hypothesis within 2 days. She'd mentioned a colleague transfer from another office 6 months earlier, noted in the specific neutral way she noted colleagues she found competent. Clay Tanner, project strategist, she'd said. Good at his job. 6 months ago. The timeline of the gym schedule change, the new perfume, the face-down phone, it began approximately 6 months ago. I didn't do anything with this information yet. I wrote it in the Notes app of my phone. In a file I labeled contractor estimates, and I sat with it. The first red herring arrived from an unexpected direction and nearly undid me entirely. Renee's sister, Petra, called me on a Tuesday when Renee was at work. This was not unusual. Petra and I had always had an independent warmth, the kind that develops between in-laws who genuinely like each other. But the call had a different quality, an ambient tension she was trying to smooth over. She told me that Renee had been under significant stress, that the new project she was managing was demanding in ways she hadn't anticipated, that she'd been struggling privately and hadn't wanted to burden me. Petra said this with the particular careful emphasis of someone delivering a prepared message, and at the end she said, "She loves you, Curtis. She's just going through something. Give her some room." I thanked Petra. I was genuine about it. Then I sat in the kitchen for an hour thinking. Either Petra is telling me something true about a stressed wife who has withdrawn but is still faithful, or Renee has told Petra enough to prime this conversation without telling her the full truth. Both explanations were available. I could feel myself wanting the first one, the way you want water when you're thirsty, urgently, past reason. I chose neither. I kept watching. What I found, when I began looking with real attention, was a financial pattern I hadn't seen before. Our finances were largely shared: joint account for the household, individual accounts for personal spending, an arrangement we'd been comfortable with for years. I'd never scrutinized her personal account because scrutiny had never felt like something our marriage required. Now I looked. Cash withdrawals, regular, modest, consistent. Over 5 months, they added up to more than I'd have expected from the ordinary personal spending she'd always described. Hotel restaurants, from context and amount, appeared in 2 charges that bore the name of a boutique property I knew by reputation. A discreet place in the business district, the kind of establishment where the staff are paid to remember very little about their guests. And 1 charge, 6 weeks old, that I almost missed: a storage facility. Monthly. Auto-renewing. Renee did not have a storage unit. I had not signed for a storage unit. I told Theo. Not everything. I told him about the name, the financial pattern, the storage unit. I did not tell him how I'd found the financial information, because I understood that I had crossed a line in finding it, and I was not yet ready to examine that crossing too carefully. He listened without interrupting, which took visible effort. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The storage unit," he said. "Yeah. That's not stress," he said. "No," I said. He offered me his garage, specifically the above-garage space he used for equipment overflow, which had a door and a lock and was invisible from the street. He said if I needed somewhere to think, somewhere that wasn't inside the house I shared with her, I had a key. That was Theo, 19 years, and that was his response. I didn't tell him how much that meant. I didn't need to. 2 days after the Theo conversation, I received a message. It came to my personal email, not the shared household account, but the one I'd had since before the marriage, the one Renee knew about but had no reason to monitor. The sender address was a string of random characters at a generic domain, the kind of throwaway account that takes 90 seconds to create. The message contained 3 things: a date and time, a location, a parking structure on the east side of downtown, and 4 words: "Check the gray Audi." That was all. I sat at my desk for a long time. I considered the obvious explanations: a mistake, a wrong address, someone else's story that had found its way to me by error. I considered, with less comfort, the non-obvious explanation: that someone who knew what was happening had decided I should know too, and had chosen this specific, anonymous method of telling me. I went the following evening, which was Thursday, Renee's gym night. The parking structure was 3 levels, public, attached to a building of mixed offices and retail. I walked the levels slowly, the way you walk when you're looking for something you're not sure you want to find. On the 2nd level, I found a gray Audi. Current model, clean, the registration sticker visible through the windshield showing a name I didn't recognize. Sitting on the passenger seat, visible through the glass, was a gray scarf with a pattern I recognized without any uncertainty. It was Renee's. The investigation phase reveals the full psychological cost of the transition from suspicion to evidence-seeking. What Curtis calls becoming a different kind of person. He has crossed from the passive receipt of uncomfortable information into the active gathering of it, and this transition carries significant emotional weight. Petra's phone call is the section's most sophisticated element. It functions as a planted misdirection that is not entirely false. Renee is under stress. The marriage is deteriorating. These are real. But Petra has been given a partial narrative that she passes on in good faith, transforming her into an unwitting instrument of the deception, someone who misleads without meaning to, whose reliability Curtis has no reason to question. This is the most insidious form of information management, the use of trustworthy intermediaries to deliver curated truth. The storage unit is the moment the story's complexity significantly deepens. Storage units require planning. They represent the deliberate creation of a space outside the shared life, physically, logistically, financially. Whatever is inside it has been put there with intention. This is not the chaos of an impulsive affair, it is infrastructure. The anonymous email is the story's pivot into active thriller territory, and its forward directness. Check the gray Audi suggests a sender who is either watching this situation closely or directly affected by it. The scarf on the passenger seat lands as the section's emotional apex, not because of what it proves in a legal sense, but because of what it eliminates, the last possibility of innocent explanation. Curtis has held that possibility carefully, like a fragile object, for weeks. The gray scarf, recognizable without any uncertainty, is the moment it falls. After the parking structure, I did not go home. I drove to Theo's garage, parked on the street outside, and sat in the dark for a long time with the engine off and my hands still on the wheel. The city made its ordinary sounds around me. A bus, someone's music through a window. The specific metropolitan indifference that makes grief feel both very small and completely unsupported simultaneously. I went inside. Theo made coffee. He didn't ask me anything. He just sat across from me and waited. And after a while, I told him what I'd found in the parking structure. He looked at his hands. He didn't say I told you or I knew it or anything else that would have been about him. He just said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find out how deep it goes," I said. The anonymous sender had not finished with me. 4 days after the parking structure, a second message arrived. Same throwaway account. This one contained an address, a storage facility in an industrial area on the western edge of the city, and a unit number. No other text. Accompanying the message was a photograph, taken through a partially open car window, slightly out of focus at the edges. Renee and a man I now recognized from the party. The dark jacket, the easy posture, sitting in the front seat of the gray Audi. Close, her hand on his forearm. Neither of them aware of the camera. The photograph was professional-grade quality despite the informal framing. Whoever was sending these had access to real equipment and real proximity. I began to understand that there was more to this than a sympathetic stranger. Someone specific was building a case, and they had chosen me as the recipient. I needed to find out why, but first, I needed to see what was in the storage unit. The facility required a code to enter. This was the detail that stopped me for nearly a week. Whatever code Renee used was not in any combination I could guess from 9 years of shared life. I tried birthdays, addresses, the year we met. I tried the code for our home alarm, the pin for the garage door. Nothing. It was Theo who suggested, with the lateral thinking of someone who works on machines for relaxation, that if the anonymous sender had provided the location and the unit number, they might be willing to provide more. I replied to the throwaway address. One line, "I need the access code." 12 hours later, a 5-digit number arrived. The code worked. What I found inside the unit I need to describe carefully, because it was not what I had prepared myself for. I had expected evidence of an affair, the physical evidence of two people meeting in private spaces. What I found was that, and something significantly more. On a metal shelving rack along the back wall, a binder. Inside it, printed documents, account statements bearing names I didn't recognize, financial transfers between accounts I had never seen referenced in our household finances, correspondence between Renee and a name that appeared in the header of several documents as Aaron Wakefield, with a law firm letterhead I'd never seen. The letters between Renee and this attorney, dated over a period of 8 months, were methodical. They described an asset protection strategy, a plan to move shared marital assets into independent accounts before initiating a divorce proceeding, a timeline. The language of the letters was professional and careful, and what they described, in the precise vocabulary of someone who had been planning this for a very long time, was the systematic preparation to exit this marriage with maximum financial advantage and minimum legal exposure. She had been preparing this exit for the better part of a year. The affair with Clay Tanner was not the primary event. It was the secondary one. The primary event was a calculated, coordinated plan to dismantle our shared financial life before I was aware enough to protect myself from it. I stood in that storage unit for a long time, in the smell of dry air and cardboard and industrial shelving, holding a binder that showed me the actual shape of the thing I'd been living inside. I photographed every page. Then I closed the binder, replaced it exactly as I'd found it, and walked out into the pale afternoon light. I hired an attorney before I went to the cabin. I want to be clear about this because the sequencing matters. By the time I confronted Renee, I had already handed copies of everything from the storage unit to a legal professional who had reviewed them and confirmed what they represented. I had not acted in rage. I had not made a single decision from the raw edge of emotion. I had done the thing I'd been training myself, without knowing it, to do across the entire previous 2 months. I had been methodical. The cabin was Renee's family property, a small house 2 hours north that had belonged to her parents and passed to her after their deaths. She'd been going there, according to the calendar entry I'd been able to access through our shared account, for a personal retreat that weekend. 2 nights. Alone, the entry said. I drove there on Saturday morning. The gray Audi was parked outside. I knocked. I did not storm. I knocked the way you knock on the door of a house you have every legal and relational right to enter. And when Renee opened it, the particular way her face changed in the 2 seconds between recognition and recalibration told me everything I would have needed to know even without the storage unit, the photographs, and the 8 months of documented financial preparation. He was in the room behind her. I could see him in the periphery, standing, very still, the particular stillness of someone processing a situation faster than they can respond to it. Curtis, she said, the voice of someone buying seconds. We need to talk, I said. Alone. He left without being asked twice. We sat at the kitchen table of the cabin where she'd spent summers as a child, and I put printed copies of the storage unit documents on the table between us. Not all of them. A selection, enough to make the shape of things immediately legible. She looked at them. She looked at me. How long? I asked. Which part? She said. And I want to record this accurately, because the question was not defensive. It was a genuine request for clarification from a woman who had been operating several simultaneous processes and wanted to know which one I was asking about. It was, in its way, the most honest moment of the entire confrontation. All of it, I said. A pause. Clay, 8 months. The legal planning, about the same. Petra called me, I said. Told me you were under stress. Something crossed her face. Not guilt. Calculation. I didn't tell her to call. But you knew she would. No answer. Were you ever going to tell me? I asked. I was going to leave, she said. I had a timeline. And the money you've been moving. She looked at the table. That's mine. Some of it is, I said. Not all of it. My attorney will be specific about which. The word attorney, I watched it arrive. The slight contraction of control. I'm not going to fight with you, I said. I don't need to. I have what I need. I just wanted to sit here, in this room, and tell you that I know. All of it. And that I'm not surprised. And that I'm going to be fine. She said nothing for a moment. Then, I didn't want to hurt you. I believe you, I said. I also believe you wanted what you wanted more than you didn't want to hurt me. And I can understand that. I just don't have to live inside it anymore. I stood up. I collected my copies. I put on my jacket. At the door, I paused. Tell Wakefield his paperwork is going to need revision, I said. My attorney is better than he is. I walked to my car. The drive back to the city took 2 hours. I played nothing on the radio. I ate a gas station sandwich somewhere around the halfway point. The sky did the gradual thing it does in late afternoon, blue to pale to the particular amber that arrives about an hour before full dark, and I drove through all of it in a silence that was not empty. It was, for the first time in a very long time, mine. The discovery of the storage unit represents the story's most significant structural reframe. What Curtis believed was the central event, the affair, is revealed to be peripheral to a deeper and more coldly premeditated scheme. Renee is not simply a wife who sought emotional connection elsewhere. She is a person who, over 8 months, systematically constructed the infrastructure of her own exit while maintaining the appearance of a functional marriage. This revelation elevates the story's conflict from the register of personal betrayal to something that involves premeditation, legal maneuvering, and financial exploitation. The psychological profile this reveals in Renee is that of someone with high strategic intelligence and significant capacity for emotional compartmentalization. She was not torn. She was planning. The confrontation scene is psychologically powerful precisely because of what it refuses to provide: dramatic catharsis. There is no shouting, no tearful breakdown, no admission of remorse. Renee's question, which part, is chilling not because it's cruel, but because it's honest. She has been managing multiple operations simultaneously and is genuinely uncertain which one he's asking about. This is the behavior of someone who has been living inside strategic complexity for so long that she has lost the register for emotional transparency. Curtis's response, measured, evidenced, attorney-referenced, and ultimately dignified, represents the fullest expression of the transformation he's been undergoing since that parking structure. He does not need her to collapse. He does not need her to apologize. He needs to say, in her presence and his own, that he sees the full picture and that he is leaving it with agency intact. The walk to his car is the story's true climax. Not the documents. Not the confrontation. The moment Curtis Wakefield walks out of a room he no longer has to be in. The week after the cabin was the strangest week of my life. Strange not because of external chaos. There was very little of that. Strange because of the quality of the internal silence. For 2 months, I had been carrying the compressing weight of suspicion and accumulating evidence and restrained emotion, and now that weight was gone, and the absence of it felt like a kind of lightness I hadn't known I'd been missing. Renee came home from the cabin on Sunday evening. I was in the living room, reading, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she came in, as if making an assessment of the room's emotional temperature. I looked up and then back at my book. "We should talk about practical things," I said. "Okay," she said. We talked about practical things. The house. She would stay. I would find somewhere to be while the legal process determined the division. The accounts. She had already moved money she'd have to move back, and my attorney had begun the paperwork. Her attorney, Aaron Wakefield, would be receiving formal correspondence by the end of the week. She sat across from me and absorbed all of this with the controlled composure that I now understood as her primary mode, and I watched her and felt, with some surprise, very little anger. Anger requires ongoing investment of energy. I had withdrawn my investment. She asked if I wanted to try counseling. I thought about this seriously, which she deserved, and I said no. "Is there anything I could do?" she asked. "No," I said. "Not because I'm punishing you. Because there isn't." She nodded slowly. There was something in her eyes in that moment that I think was genuine, a quality of loss that wasn't strategic, that had slipped through the composure briefly before she recovered it. I noted it. I was not moved by it in the way she might have hoped, but I was not unmoved entirely. 9 years do not become nothing because you discover they were built on a partial fiction. "I need you to be honest with me about one thing," I said. She waited. "Was any of it real?" A long silence. "Yes," she said. "The beginning was real." "Okay," I said. "That's enough." I moved into Theo's above-garage apartment the following weekend. It was a single room with a bathroom, a hot plate, and a window that looked out over the street where he'd lived for 15 years. I'd helped him paint it once, maybe 6 years ago, a Sunday project with bad music and good beer, and now it was where I was going to live for the next several months while the legal process did its methodical work. I carried my things up in 4 trips. Not much. Clothes, my laptop, the books that felt most like mine, the coffee equipment I'd bought before the marriage and therefore knew with certainty was mine. I sat on the edge of the small bed in the late afternoon light and looked at the room, and what I felt was not despair, but something closer to clarity. This was small. It was temporary. It was honest. Those were 3 qualities I had not been able to apply to my living situation for longer than I'd realized. Theo appeared at the door around 6 with takeout containers and a 6-pack, and he sat in the one chair while I sat on the edge of the bed, and we ate without talking much. At some point he said, "You know what gets me?" "What?" "You're the least angry I've ever seen you." I thought about this. "I think I was angry for a long time before I knew what I was angry about," I said. "And then once I knew, there was no room left." He nodded. He handed me a beer. "That's either enlightened or disturbing," he said. "Probably both," I said. We sat in the small room as the street outside went from afternoon to evening, and it was one of the better hours I'd had in recent memory, not despite the circumstances, but somehow running parallel to them, the way a clear day can exist right alongside a complicated one. The legal process took the shape my attorney had outlined. Wakefield's asset protection strategy, documented in the binder I'd photographed, was presented as evidence of bad faith asset concealment. The transfers Renee had made over the preceding months were largely reversed. The settlement that emerged from the negotiations was not punitive. I was not interested in punishment, but it was fair, which is what I'd asked my attorney to pursue. There was one final conversation with Renee, managed by both sets of legal representation, a brief and quiet affair in a conference room that smelled like recycled air and the particular anxious neutrality of legal proceedings. She looked well. She had the composed control of someone who has accepted an outcome even while remaining dissatisfied with it. Clay Tanner's name did not come up. I didn't ask. When it was done, I shook the hands I needed to shake, and I walked out into the street, and the afternoon was doing the amber thing again. That late light that had started to feel like mine specifically, the light I associated with driving 2 hours north to a cabin and knowing exactly what I was going to do. The fallout phase reveals Curtis's psychological transformation in its clearest form. Theo's observation, "You're the least angry I've ever seen you," is diagnostically precise. Curtis has moved through a grief process that most people experience in chaos and confusion, but that he has navigated with a methodical steadiness that is simultaneously his greatest strength and his most revealing characteristic. He processes in private, thoroughly, and by the time anything becomes visible to others, the processing is largely complete. His answer to Theo, "I was angry for a long time before I knew what I was angry about," is the story's most psychologically sophisticated line. It identifies retroactively what the entire investigation period actually was, not the search for evidence of betrayal, but the gradual translation of a diffuse, long-carried emotional state into a specific, actionable understanding. The question he asks Renee, "Was any of it real?" is the most vulnerable moment of the entire narrative, and his acceptance of "the beginning was real" as sufficient is an act of genuine emotional maturity. He is not insisting on a comprehensive account of every moment, not demanding that all 9 years be reassessed as worthless. He is asking for one true thing, receiving it, and deciding it's enough to close with. The small apartment above Theo's garage, painted once in an afternoon of good music and bad beer, now the place where Curtis is genuinely starting over, functions as a powerful symbol of honest return. He has come back to something small, temporary, and truthful, which is a more solid foundation than the large, permanent, and partially fictional structure he has left behind. 6 months after the cabin, I was living in my own apartment. Second floor, corner unit, 2 rooms that I'd furnished slowly and deliberately with things I actually liked, not things accumulated by the drift of shared life, not compromises arrived at across years of different preferences, but objects chosen one at a time by a single person who knew what he wanted. A reading chair, a good lamp, a kitchen setup that was small and efficient and organized in the specific way my mind organized things when no one else's preferences were in the equation. It was, I want to be clear, a good apartment. Not large, not impressive by the standards of the renovated house where I'd spent 7 years. But every surface in it was exactly where I'd put it, and nothing in it was a remnant of something I was trying not to think about. And when I woke up in the mornings, the light came through the east-facing window and fell across the floor in a way that I had never arranged and could therefore never take for granted. I went running now, which I hadn't done in years. I'd started in the 3rd month, partly for the obvious health reasons, partly because I needed, during that period, something that was uncomplicated and that delivered a simple, reliable result. You run, you get tired, you feel better. The mechanics of it suited the version of myself I was becoming. By the 6th month, I was running 4 mornings a week, and the streets of the neighborhood at 6 a.m. had become as familiar to me as the shape of my own thinking. Both were cleaner than they used to be, and both made more sense in the particular early light before the day complicated itself. I called Theo most Sundays. We still did the garage project. He'd moved on from the engine to something more ambitious, a full restoration that was going to take another year at least, and I came by when I could, which was more often now that my time was entirely mine to allocate. I had not contacted Renee since the conference room. This was not a performance of indifference. It was the natural result of having genuinely concluded something. There were moments, early on, when a specific memory surfaced with the unexpected force that emotional memories tend to have. The way she'd laughed at a particular thing once, the smell of the kitchen on winter mornings before everything meant what it eventually meant. And I allowed these moments to exist without either pursuing or suppressing them. Grief is not an enemy. Grief is simply the shape that something takes when it ends. Clay Tanner, I'd heard through the peripheral network of acquaintances, was no longer working at Renee's firm. I didn't know the details and didn't pursue them. Whatever that story was, it was not mine anymore. The anonymous sender, I'd thought about them for months. I had a theory. It was not the kind of theory I could prove, and I'd made the decision not to try, because whatever the anonymous sender's motivations were, whether they were the primary injured party or a witness with their own stake, They had given me something I couldn't have constructed myself in the same time frame. They had given me the storage unit, the photographs, the head start. I had written one final reply to the throwaway address about 2 weeks after the legal settlement. For words, thank you. I'm okay. The address had bounced. It no longer existed. I met her on a Saturday at the grocery store, which is, apparently, where some things begin. She was trying to reach a box on a high shelf, which is how I came to reach it for her, which is how she laughed and said thank you in a way that was the specific, unguarded laugh of someone who wasn't performing. We exchanged maybe 6 sentences in the cereal aisle, and then she went one way and I went another, and I paid for my groceries and loaded them into my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. I didn't feel what I'd felt at the beginning with Renee. That early intensity that I now understood had been, in part, a response to her quality of managed mystery, the pull of something composed and slightly withheld. What I felt was simpler, a warmth, uncomplicated, the pleasant awareness of someone who had laughed without calculation. I went home and unpacked my groceries and put them away in the order that made the most sense, which is the order I'd developed on my own over the past 6 months, which was the exact right order for my specific kitchen and my specific habits and no one else's. I thought about the woman at the store, and I thought, maybe, when it's time, and only if it's honest. That was the new standard. Honesty, not perfection, not intensity, not the pull of something beautifully managed. Just the simple, durable, quietly radical fact of 2 people telling each other the truth. I made coffee and sat by the east-facing window and watched the light do what it did, which was simply what it was, and I was content in a way that had nothing to do with resolution or victory or the satisfaction of having been right. It had to do with presence, with being genuinely inside my own life, for the first time in longer than I could precisely remember. I have thought about what I would tell someone who is in the place I was, standing at the edge of a party feeling invisible, carrying an unease they can't name, reading the same sentence in a book for the 3rd time, because their mind keeps pulling toward a question they're afraid to ask. I would tell them, trust the pull, not as an instruction to chaos, not as permission to dismantle everything on instinct. But the pull exists for a reason. Your body processes information your conscious mind is working to suppress, and the unease you can't articulate is often the most accurate thing you know. Ask the question, tolerate the answer, and understand that finding out the truth about your life, even when the truth is hard, even when it costs you the structure you built it around, is not a loss. It is the beginning of the version where you get to be the architect. I finished my coffee. I rinsed the cup. I put my running shoes on. The morning was doing what it did, and I went out into it. Curtis's story operates as a case study in what happens when extreme emotional avoidance meets extreme strategic deception, when a man who processes everything internally shares a life with a woman who manages everything externally, and the 2 systems eventually collide at the cost of 9 years. The accumulation effect in this story is unusually precise. Almost every element that ultimately contributed to the collapse had a counterpart that had been visible, registered, and consciously reinterpreted for years. The face-down phone, the rehearsed explanations, the managed warmth of Petra's call, these were all mechanisms of the same sustained performance. Curtis's blind spot was not stupidity or naivety. It was the particular failure mode of a person who equates consistency with safety. He believed that because he was reliable, because he showed up and maintained and kept his mouth shut about the things that troubled him, the structure would hold. What he didn't understand was that a structure held together by one person's maintenance is not the same thing as a structure that is genuinely stable. The most significant psychological reveal of the entire arc is the storage unit, the moment the story shifts from being about infidelity to being about premeditation. Renee was not a woman who fell into an affair and struggled with it. She was a woman who decided to leave, built the exit strategy methodically, and maintained the marriage as infrastructure during the construction phase. Understanding this distinction is what allows Curtis to leave the cabin without anger. He is not the victim of a weakness or a moment's bad judgment. He is the collateral figure in a plan that was always going to arrive at this destination. His final state, running at 6 a.m., choosing objects he actually likes, measuring new connections against the standard of honesty, represents the recovery not just from a specific betrayal, but from the longer, subtler betrayal of having made himself smaller than he was for the duration of a life he was only partially occupying. The woman in the cereal aisle is not a consolation prize. She is evidence of something restored, the ability to feel uncomplicated warmth for an uncomplicated reason. And that, more than any legal outcome or confrontation or documented evidence, is the real resolution of this story.